might be the only one that actually benefits from cramming just because I actually know how to study so well. In this video, I'm going to review a bit about how I can study so fast, but just the disclaimer, of course, I don't recommend that everyone crams. I think that if you have too many knowledge gaps or if you're just not caught up in general, of course, you shouldn't be studying last minute. I'm just reporting on the fact that it worked for me, but that does not mean it might work for you. So chill. So here's what I'm thinking, right? All these geeks have been studying for days, weeks before the test. And bro, I literally walk up to school 30 minutes the period before the test, start studying, right? 30 minutes the period before. How is it I still get the same mark as them? That just does not make sense. And by the way, I have a 95 average right now, right? To me, the results are just too unbalanced. It seems like they're putting so much more effort into studying when in reality, I'm getting the same results as them in 30 minutes of studying. How is it that? So this is a debate between cramming and spreading out studying. So here are some of the pros and cons for like traditional cramming, right? For some of the pros, first of all, you're just studying in a shorter period of time. And this allows for Parkinson's law to activate, which is like the work expands towards for the time given to it or something. I forgot, right? And essentially that means that if you give work a certain amount of time, usually that work will expand or shrink to that amount of time. Now, that doesn't mean that if you give yourself 10 minutes to finish an entire assignment that takes days, right? That doesn't mean that you will magically finish it. It just means that when you are given less time, you're way more likely to work more efficiently. And actually, you can probably fit the work into that time frame by focusing on efficiency. So cramming allows you to prioritize correctly and actually work very fast, right? And because you're also doing a lot of things at the same time, you're also allowed to batch things, right? Meaning, for example, you can do 3 practice papers at once. Another thing is because you're specifically putting a lot of things together, it allows for a flow state where you work long enough in order to get into the flow, which is a human optimal performance, right? And the final thing about cramming is the fact that it's last minute. And of course, there's other like cons about that. But the pro of it being last minute is because there's more motivation. And if you are in a situation where you can choose more motivation or less motivation, no other consequences, right? Of course, you choose more motivation. Now, I'll address the consequences later, right? Now, the cons of traditional cramming, right? First of all, the biggest one, retention. Usually, people claim to forget everything. And that's true because traditional cramming involves not knowing actually how to study effectively enough to remember it long enough. So usually the retention is shallow, usually the understanding is shallow, right? And this is not only because people don't understand how to study effectively in short periods of time in order to pick up everything and understand things deeply fast enough. It's also because of no spacing effect or space retrieval. The spacing effect is pretty much where you give yourself time to forget a little bit about the things you just learned in order to then retrieve it later on. And because your brain forgot a little bit about it, it takes effort to retrieve the information. And therefore, that effort reinforces how important that is in your brain, which makes you remember it longer. And without this technique being able to be used because you're doing it last minute, you're not able to benefit from the stuff like forgetting curve, right? But I'll address those things later. Another big con is just stress. Since you're doing last minute, of course, you get motivation and instant like adrenaline to do work. However, you're just stressed out. And finally, usually because people don't know how to work quickly enough, or they're just not caught up in general and they rely on that last minute cramming, usually there's just too much content to go through and they can't go through everything and learn all the important parts. Either this is because they just didn't pick up on it the first time or they don't know how to prioritize. Of course, shorter periods of time pushes you to prioritization, but most people still don't know how to abuse it. Now, why do some people like, for example, Justin Sung, tell you to cram early? Isn't cramming a bad thing? Well, the thing is, if you cram early, this reduces not only some of the biggest cons, like for example, stress, because you're not no longer chasing a deadline that quickly, but it also improves depth of understanding. Now you have more time to study and be careful about everything you're learning. If you cram late and you mistake how much time you have and you don't have enough time until you actually need to like execute on the test, you'll run out of time to go through all the important parts. And therefore you'll kind of miss some of the parts where you need to actually have a good depth of understanding. But with cramming early, now you can kind of take your time, but like that's not the point of cramming. You do it quickly, but kind of take your time on the parts that are most important. Now, the interesting thing about cramming is the fact that it still doesn't really incorporate the spacing effect or space retrieval that much. It's just condensing your studying or learning period into a very small period of time. And honestly, I'm not saying that the space retrieval isn't good for you. I think that it technically is good for memory. However, what I believe is that it's actually not necessary. Of course, there's benefits to applying it in anywhere. Trying to memorize things over and over again does help. However, if you're relying on it, if you need that technique in order to remember something, and your brain's telling you something, it's the fact that it doesn't want to remember it. And what does that mean? You're not making it relevant enough in your brain. You're not understanding it deeply enough and making enough connections with the thing. So what I'm saying is, if you're relying on the spacing effect, that's probably an indication that you're not understanding things deeply enough. Now, I'm not saying that everything can be understood deeply enough the first time so that you can remember it, because there are some things, like for example, complex terms that you've never heard of in your entire life that relate to a very weird concept, or like random dates. Of course, these things are hard to remember just by understanding. However, I think 99% of them actually could be, because, well, for the examples that I just gave, for the terms, you can just understand what the terms mean, how they relate to similar terms with just as complex names, how the word was derived. That would be so helpful for you to understand it and not just try to memorize it. For dates, you can just associate that specific number with all of the events in the date. Depth of understanding really, really helps with retention. And I'm a strong believer that you should focus on depth of understanding rather than spaced retrieval. And this is why I think that cramming early is actually pretty good advice. On top of it just being studying faster, it's also a quick way to instantly know like what your knowledge gaps are and like see if you're actually like cooked before the test, right? However, surprisingly, I'm actually not talking about cramming early in this video. I actually believe that cramming late might actually be beneficial for me, and it might actually be better than cramming early. Like, bro, I've never heard anyone say this before, but like, I swear, for my specific situation, I'm not saying that it will work for you, but I genuinely think that cramming late might be better for me than cramming early. Here's why, right? I have a ton of reasons. Firstly, the first thing I want to address is forgetting. Think about it. Let's say you read a book a week ago versus you read a book yesterday. Which book would you remember more about? Of course, it would be the one that's most recent, right? So the thing is, no matter what, we forget things. Okay, so that was a pretty easy lesson, right? A lot of people talk about the forgetting curve online and link it to a reason as to why you should use flashcards. I actually don't believe in the numbers of the forgetting curve. I think that forgetting curve as a concept is correct. However, I don't believe that you forget everything in one day. It just does not make sense. What I believe is that you forget based on the amount of connections that you make. If you make 100 different connections and that deep of an understanding towards one specific thing, that forgetting will be way, way longer. Of course, if you review it over and over again, I think that the forgetting curve will shallow, like, not be as deep. But depth of understanding reduces retention, and this is the flaw with the forgetting curve. The forgetting curve doesn't address for how many connections you made, how relevant you made the information in your brain, right? So what am I trying to say? If you understand things deeply, the retention isn't that bad. Like, you don't forget 50% of everything on the first day. Like, it just doesn't make sense, right? I think the 50% metric actually only applies to like rote memorizing words. But even then, those words will by default have different amounts of connection based on your understanding of them, right? And a lot of other things like connection to identity or your whatever your values, right? So if we forget things eventually and the retention isn't as bad as 50% on the first day, do you think it's better to review everything one day before the test or 5 days before the test? Technically, objectively, just because we forget things, it's better to review things one day before the test, right? If you refresh your memory right before the test, technically that's better than refreshing your memory before that, just because you forget more. Now, this isn't to advocate for you to passively read notes right before the test, right? And that's like not a good way to review, rather do practice questions and stuff, right? So what that argument means is objectively, the closer that you review before the test, the more you remember, right? Now, let me address the other complaints, right? Now, how can I pull off late cramming as a good study technique? First of all, I really think that if you're not caught up, if you have a ton of knowledge gaps and you just don't address them, you wait until like way later, like until the exam to address them, you're cooked. It's just stacking up learning for your future self. There's just no point. Why don't you just learn it right now since you have time? I never leave a concept to deeply understand later on. I always just understand it and learn it in the moment. Every single subject, I'm usually caught up to the lesson that they're teaching. I'm not like slacking behind. I don't need to review the things like taught yesterday. I already understood them. I can already do the homework questions and like do it perfectly, right? If you gave me a test, like if you gave me a pop quiz, I'd be confident enough to not be scared of it because I already learned everything and caught up completely. This is my secret to how I can study so little and so fast. Now, of course, there's other secrets, like for example, understanding prioritization. Instantly, when I study, I instantly skip the redundant parts. What I mean by this is I skip relearning the things I already know, and I skip the things that I already know are not going to be important. How do I do this? Practice questions, practice tests. These things outline the exact things most similar that will appear on the test, which will probably be the most important things to study. Now, of course, if you only do practice tests, these will skip over majority of the less common knowledge that you might need for the test. How do I know all these things in order to boost my average to a 95? Well, I just listened in class before. I just understood the small things that the teacher told us before. And I'm going to go back to the point that I was talking about before, right? If you understand these small things deeply enough, the retention will be long enough and you won't really need to review it over and over again. If you need to review something over and over again, your brain is saying, I don't think this is important. I don't think that we should remember this. So I can pull off late cramming because not only do I understand prioritization, I also have a deep understanding of everything during the lessons. So there's so little that I actually forgot that I need to learn right before the test. And this makes it so that I don't have to skip anything. I have so little to actually study. So understanding this, now you can understand why, no matter what, it will probably take me 30 minutes to an hour just to study. No matter what, even if I cram early or late, even if I spread out my studying, it will just take me that long. It doesn't matter. So why do I choose cramming instead of spreading out my studying? Because I can abuse batching and flow states like we talked about before. Why do I choose to cram late instead of early? Because I can abuse the motivation. And well, what about the stress aspect? The thing is, stress is all about perspective. If you actually understood my position, like if you understand me and know that I've done this for a lot of the time, but I've experimented with myself trying to actually not listen in class and see if I can cram before. Like I've literally done that before. If you've tested out this study method for months or maybe even years, you will naturally have the confidence in yourself to study so quickly. Plus, on top of that, I know how to calm myself down. So not only do I not get the thoughts of being stressful because I'm confident in myself, also, if I do end up getting those thoughts somehow, I know how to calm myself down, and through like double breathing and just thinking about my own thoughts and being like, wait, why am I even stressed out? I just need to execute in order to learn enough for the test. That's literally it. An interesting thing that I think about is the fact that if you gave me less time to study, I'd actually be less effective. And the reason for this is obviously the stuff like Parkinson's law, right? But this just proves that it's actually pretty good to train yourself to work under pressure, under very restricted situations. I think the only kind of negative that is bad about this is the fact that you're training yourself to work under pressure. However, like I said, I'm actually coping with pressure by just being confident and knowing how to like not like de-stress myself, right? And in worst case scenario, if let's say subconsciously I'm making my brain think that I can only work under pressure, right? Don't you think that's actually a better thing than training your brain to think that you can only work not under pressure, right? Working under pressure is more of a dire situation than not working under pressure, right? So if you can train your brain to think that I can work under pressure, that would just be better. Like you wouldn't need to like worry about working not under pressure, right? You only need to worry about when the situation is dire. The last thing I want to mention is like even though I'm literally like a study YouTuber now somehow, sometimes I literally forget about the test. Like I literally literally find out about the test on the day. Like, I go to school right before school starts. I find out about the test. And all this actually preparing, like knowing how to study, lets me actually pull off good marks before, like when I go to school. If I don't even know that there is a test, it lets me pull off marks like that. So I'm not obviously saying like, oh yeah, don't like just forget about all your tests and like go to school unprepared. Like, obviously prepare yourself, because the reason why I could cram late is actually, the core reason is because I'm always caught up with the lesson. I'm never falling behind, and I just know how to work efficiently. Tell me what you think in the comments. Maybe I'm just trolling, maybe I'm coping all this. But if you like the video, just check the description. You might want to join my Discord server and stuff.